A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
He didn't really know exactly why this ridge was here.
For most of the 20th century, archaeologists thought they knew exactly when the first humans arrived in North America, where they came from, and the exact route they traveled to get here. The science was settled. Then a team digging in the Oregon desert pulled stone tools from the ground, sent them to a lab, and received results nobody was prepared for.
So that our students can start closer to the bottom. And they're really well trained and know how to excavate, and they follow the instruction of Pat. And
20,000-year-old blood preserved inside the stone
is a part of that Hertzian cone. And I can control that shape and that size by tilting that rock and hitting it with different things.
And what it revealed did not just push back the timeline, it shattered the entire story. What if everything we were taught about the first Americans was never the full story? The discovery that shattered a century of archaeological certainty. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists had a story they trusted completely. The story went like this. Around 13,000 years ago, the first humans crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska and slowly pushed south through a narrow corridor that had opened between two massive glaciers covering most of Canada. These people, known as the Clovis culture, were considered the original Americans. If anyone came forward with evidence suggesting humans had arrived earlier, the archaeological community had a standard response ready. They called it contamination, misinterpretation. The timeline, as far as most researchers were concerned, was settled. Then a team from the University of Oregon started digging at a rock shelter in the high desert of eastern Oregon.
And then I also did a little bit of working around on top of the rim, and I found a lot of points, spear points, that are probably 8,000 years or older.
And the settled timeline began to fall apart one layer at a time. The site was called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Nobody expected it to produce anything controversial. The team had not gone there to rewrite history. Their original goals were modest.
Best archaeology in the most complex and difficult settings that they'll probably experience in their lifetimes.
They wanted to study Ice Age animal remains and track how the local environment had changed over thousands of years. The Bureau of Land Management archaeologist, who had worked in that district for 21 years, was on site with them. It was routine fieldwork in a quiet, largely overlooked corner of the landscape. Nothing about the site suggested it was about to become one of the most disruptive archaeological finds in American history. What the researchers pulled out of the ground were stone tools and animal bones, unremarkable on their own. But when the lab results came back, everyone went quiet. The tools had blood on them. Blood that old should not exist. It almost never survives. But there it was. When they dated the sediment layer, they used a method called optically stimulated luminescence. What that means in plain terms is this: certain mineral grains, when buried, stop absorbing light. They essentially freeze in place. Scientists can measure exactly how long those grains have been sitting in darkness, which tells you precisely when that layer of Earth was last exposed to the surface. That reading came back at nearly 20,000 years old. And buried inside that layer were stone tools with deliberately sharpened edges and animal bones covered in cut marks.
Revealed animal proteins on one of the many tools found in the rock shelter. These tools were used for many purposes.
Not the kind left by predators, but the clean, angled strikes of someone methodically stripping meat and pulling hide from a carcass. People were hunting and processing kills at that site 7,000 years before the Clovis model said the first human being ever set foot on this continent. That is not a minor revision. That is the entire foundation of the story cracking open beneath your feet. But the real shock came when archaeologists realized that the ground itself was preserving a perfectly ordered record of human activity stretching far deeper into the past than anyone thought possible. The perfectly preserved layers. When the team started working through the sediment at Rimrock Draw, something immediately stood out. The layers were undisturbed, and if you know anything about archaeological sites, you know how rare that is. Normally, the Earth is working against you. Burrowing animals tunnel through the ground and drag objects from one era into another. Tree roots grow downward over centuries and pull material with them as they push deeper. Rainwater seeps in and slowly carries small artifacts sideways, depositing them in layers they were never originally part of. All of this means that by the time archaeologists arrive, objects have been silently moving through the ground for thousands of years.
We've given talks at Oregon Archaeological Society. I've given talks to the Archaeological Society of Central Oregon in Bend.
Something left behind 10,000 years ago might be sitting in a layer that is only 2,000 years old. You can never fully trust that what you are finding actually belongs where you found it. But Rimrock Draw was different. The layers sat flat and perfectly separated from one another. Think of it like this. Every time people lived in that shelter, they left something behind. Fire ash, charcoal, bone fragments, organic waste. Over time, that material compressed into a distinct dark band in the sediment. Then, when the shelter emptied out and nobody came back for centuries, nothing was deposited. Just wind-blown dust and fine desert sand drifting in slowly through the open face of the rock shelter, settling in thin sheets over everything beneath it. No human activity, no organic material. Just sediment accumulating the way it does when a place is completely abandoned. That process formed a pale, clean layer over the top of the dark one. Then people returned, and another dark band formed. Then they left again. Another pale layer of dust and sand built up on top.
Out in the desert, walking around, maybe you'll find one, and then you can find stemmed points too on the surface, but you don't know what's before the other, or if they're at the same time. It's unclear.
That pattern repeated itself over thousands of years. Dark band, pale layer, dark band, pale layer, each one sealed perfectly on top of the last. As the team dug deeper, stone tools kept appearing. They were not mixed up. They sat separately inside their own distinct layers, each one anchored to its own period in time.
Yes, we did. This was the one, the tool, the orange agate multi-tool I call the Leatherman.
Things like handheld scrapers used to strip hide from an animal. Small, sharp blades napped from flint or obsidian for cutting meat. They were basic objects, but ones that only exist because a person sat down and deliberately made them. One set of tools would appear inside a dark band, surrounded by the ash and bone fragments of that particular period. Then a pale layer of clean sediment above it, representing centuries of emptiness. Then another dark band, and inside it another set of tools from a completely different era. It was exactly the pattern you would expect to find if different groups of people had been visiting that same shelter across thousands of years without ever crossing paths with each other. And that is exactly what the evidence was pointing to. This was not a place where one group stopped once, took shelter from a storm, and vanished. People kept coming back here, generation after generation. They knew this place existed, and they knew why it was worth returning to. The reason made sense once you understood the geography. During the Ice Age, the land surrounding that rock shelter sat beside a wetland. In the middle of a harsh, punishing desert, standing water was an extraordinary resource. Animals traveled from across the region to reach it, and the people who knew about that water kept following them there, reliably, repeatedly, across thousands of years. But the real turning point was still ahead. Deeper in the sediment, the team reached a layer sealed beneath a band of volcanic ash. What was buried underneath it would become the most direct challenge to the accepted story of when humans first arrived in North America. The giant Ice Age camel. Buried beneath the earth were teeth and jaw fragments belonging to Camelops hesternus, an extinct giant camel that once moved across North America in enormous numbers. This animal stood nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed hundreds of kilograms.
Come on, do it just, you can't. And a camel can do that. So that's another amazing characteristic.
And it had been gone from the earth for thousands of years before anyone thought to look for it here. But the bones themselves were not what disturbed the researchers most. It was the arrangement. They were not scattered the way bones scatter when an animal dies alone and rots in an open field. They were positioned in the specific, recognizable pattern that appears at human butchering sites across the ancient world. When the team examined them closely, they found repeated slicing marks concentrated at the joints. That detail matters. The joints are where a person dismembering an animal would naturally work first, cutting through connective tissue to separate the limbs and gain access to the meat. Those marks did not come from animal teeth. They did not come from weathering or the weight of sediment pressing down over centuries. They matched exactly the kind of marks that stone tools leave behind. Someone had hunted this animal, brought it down, and then stood over the carcass and methodically butchered it. To understand what that means, you have to picture the world those people were living in. Nearly 20,000 years ago, North America looked almost nothing like it does today. Glaciers covered most of Canada, and ice sheets close to 2 miles thick dominated the northern half of the continent. The open plains were shared by mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and these ancient camels moving in herds across landscapes that no longer exist. Dire wolves hunted in those same spaces. Saber-toothed cats did too. The world was colder, stranger, and far more dangerous than anything alive today can properly convey. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a group of human hunters killed a giant camel, dragged it back to that rock shelter, and cut the meat from its bones with handheld stone tools. Here is where the story gets harder to dismiss. The bones were found sealed beneath a layer of volcanic ash traced directly to a known eruption of Mount St. Helens that happened more than 15,600 years ago. Here is why that matters. When a volcano erupts, ash does not trickle down gradually. It falls all at once, blankets everything beneath it in a single event, and then hardens into a permanent sealed layer over time. When the team found that ash sitting directly above the camel bones, completely intact with no cracks or disturbance of any kind, it meant one thing. Those bones were already in the ground before the eruption happened, which means the people who butchered that camel were living in North America more than 15,600 years ago at the absolute minimum. The Clovis first theory says the first humans arrived 13,000 years ago. That is a gap of over 2,600 years. These were not the first Americans. Someone was already here. The Clovis model had not just been challenged, it had been contradicted by the Earth itself. Then came the radiocarbon dating of the camel tooth enamel, and the number that came back was approximately 18,250 years before the present day. Sit with that for a moment. What the Oregon site was now suggesting was that humans had been walking, hunting, and processing animals in the Pacific Northwest at least 5,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived. That is not a minor revision. That is the kind of finding that makes an entire field of science stop and reconsider everything it thought it knew. Then came the detail that shifted the entire tone of the discovery. Among the tools found at Rimrock Draw was a scraper, a small handheld cutting tool shaped from stone, but the stone it was made from was orange agate. That sounds like a minor detail until you understand what it means geographically. Orange agate does not exist anywhere near Rimrock Draw. The nearest known source is hundreds of miles away. Nobody picks up a rock that far from home by accident. That material had to be deliberately carried to that site, which meant one of two things.
A marsh plant or a lake plant that produces a tuber on the bottom end and that's edible, and people used it. In fact, I think there's Wapato Lake.
Either the people using that shelter were traveling vast distances across an Ice Age landscape that most researchers had assumed was barely passable, or they were trading and exchanging materials with other groups across a network that stretched hundreds of miles. Either way, these were not isolated, barely surviving stragglers clinging to existence at the edge of the continent. These were people moving through North America with purpose and range. When the tools were examined under magnification, the evidence grew harder to ignore. Tiny fractures lined the edges, the kind that form only after repeated use. They told a clear story. These tools had been used, worn down by actual hands doing actual work. And here is why that matters directly. The Clovis first theory claims that when the Clovis people arrived, They were working with a very specific and recognizable tool technology, long, fluted stone points made in a particular way. That was the signature. That was how you identified a Clovis site. But the tools at Rimrock Draw were older than Clovis and made differently, from materials sourced hundreds of miles away, showing wear patterns from sustained use. They did not fit the Clovis signature. They predated it entirely, which meant the people who made them were not Clovis people. They were someone else, someone who was already here. More so, one scraper was not found with the camel remains. It was found beneath them. It rested in a deeper layer of earth, one that had remained untouched by whatever activity left the butchered bones above. In archaeology, that detail carries a simple and unavoidable meaning. Deeper layers are older. There is no way to reverse that order without disturbing the ground, and nothing in that layer showed signs of disturbance. So the implication stood on its own. If the camel dated back more than 18,250 years, then the tool beneath it had to be older. That was the point where the discovery crossed into something far more difficult to explain. The evidence was no longer just suggesting early human presence in the region. It was pushing that presence further back than expected, into a time that challenged established timelines. The ground had preserved that sequence perfectly, layer over layer, each one holding a piece of the story, each one placing human activity earlier than anyone had been ready to accept. But even with all of that, there was still a problem. Skepticism does not disappear easily, especially when the claim carries this kind of weight. Stone tools and cut marks could be questioned, debated, reinterpreted. There was always room for doubt, no matter how small. What was needed was something final that could not be explained away or reduced to coincidence. And that discovery came next, when the team began protein residue analysis. The microscopic blood evidence. Protein residue analysis relies on what is physically trapped within the material itself. The idea is simple, but the implications are not. When a stone tool cuts through flesh, tiny amounts of blood and tissue are forced into microscopic fractures along the edge. Those traces do not just disappear. Under the right conditions, they stay there for thousands of years. That was the hope, at least. If anything had survived inside those tools, it would be buried deep within the stone, protected from the outside world. But that also meant the process had to be handled with extreme care. Any modern contamination could destroy the results, or worse, create false ones. The cleaning process came first, and it was meticulous. Every surface was carefully treated to remove anything that might have settled on the tools in recent times. The goal was to completely strip away the present and leave only what had been there since the tools were last used. It took time. It required patience. There was no room for shortcuts. Only after that did the testing begin. At first, there was nothing dramatic about it. Samples were carefully extracted from those tiny fractures where the edges had once met flesh. The work was quiet and controlled, the kind of process that does not reveal its importance until the results come back. And when they did, everything shifted. The proteins matched Bison antiquus, an extinct species that once moved across Ice Age North America in massive numbers before vanishing thousands of years ago. That identification carried a weight that was hard to ignore. It meant that the tools had not just been shaped for cutting. They had cut into a real animal, one that no longer exists, one that lived and died in a world far removed from the present. The connection tightened immediately. The evidence now existed at multiple levels at once. Geological layers established the timeline. Archaeological context placed the tools and bones together. Biological traces confirmed direct contact between tool and animal. Each line of evidence supported the others, and together they left very little room for doubt about the collapse of the Clovis first theory. The collapse of the Clovis first theory. The evidence gathered at Rimrock Draw pointed to human activity more than 18,000 years ago. That alone was enough to bury the Clovis first theory. But there was a second problem sitting underneath the first one. and it was just as damaging. The Clovis model did not just claim that humans arrived 13,000 years ago, it claimed they arrived by a specific route. The theory held that the first people crossed from Siberia into Alaska and then moved south through a narrow, ice-free corridor that had opened between two massive glaciers covering most of Canada. That corridor was the only proposed pathway into the rest of the continent. The entire model depended on it. But 18,000 years ago, that corridor did not exist. The glaciers had not yet retreated far enough to open it. The northern half of the continent was still locked under an enormous unbroken sheet of ice stretching thousands of miles. There was no gap, no passage, no route south.
The flakes are taken off with hammer stones or antler billets, moose antler, and these rounded pieces are harder to chip.
The path the Clovis model required was physically impossible at the time the Rimrock Draw evidence said humans were already living in Oregon. And yet the people at Rimrock Draw were there, hunting giant camels in the high desert, thousands of years before that corridor ever opened. If people were present that far south at that time, then they did not arrive by the route that had been accepted for so long. The timeline and the landscape simply did not allow it. So another possibility moved forward. It was one that had been considered before but never fully embraced. It is known as the coastal migration model. This theory suggests that the first Americans did not wait for an inland corridor to open. They came by sea, moving south along the Pacific coastline, traveling in small watercraft, staying close to the shore of a continent they had never seen before. That route was not safe. The North Pacific coastline 18,000 years ago was one of the most violent marine environments on Earth. Storm systems that built across thousands of miles of open ocean arrived at that coastline with nothing to slow them down. No landmass in their path, no natural barrier to absorb the force.
It kind of drapes around the hill. It goes down. It doesn't follow the contour lines very well.
By the time those storms reached the shore, they had gathered full strength, driving waves 30, 40, 50 feet high directly into the rocks. There were no harbors, no shelter, no possibility of rescue. If a wave took your boat, you were gone. And yet the evidence suggests that people made that journey anyway, stopping along the way to fish, hunt marine mammals, and harvest shellfish from the rocks. Enough food to keep moving, enough skill to survive conditions that would be considered extreme even by modern standards. What that requires is not just bravery, it requires accumulated knowledge, an understanding of tides, currents, and weather patterns that could only come from generations of people living and dying by the sea before this journey ever began. These were not wandering bands stumbling blindly across a new continent. They were experienced maritime people who read the ocean well enough to cross it. And that leads to the most unsettling thought of all. Rimrock Draw may not mark the beginning of this story. It may only be the first place where the evidence has survived clearly enough to be recognized. The deeper layers that could rewrite human history again. At Rimrock Draw, the camel tooth drew attention because of its age, and because of the clear signs that humans had butchered the animal. It seemed like a boundary at first, a point that marked how far back the evidence could safely reach. But that assumption did not hold for long once the layers beneath it were considered more carefully. The tooth was not resting on bedrock. It was not sitting at the bottom of the story. Beneath it, the earth continued, holding older sediments that had not yet been fully explored. Those deeper layers were not empty. They were already beginning to show signs that something had happened there long before the camel ever died. Small stone flakes have been recovered from below that level.
The traditional thought is they came here over the Bering Strait probably 13,000 or a little more years ago.
They are not as obvious as fully shaped tools, but they carry the same suggestion of deliberate action. Stone does not break in those patterns without force applied in a controlled way. Alongside them are subtle indicators that are harder to define but difficult to ignore once noticed. Slight disturbances in the soil, patterns that hint at repeated activity rather than random natural processes. The work at the site is far from complete. Researchers have been open about that from the beginning. Large portions of rimrock draw remain untouched because excavation comes with limits. Funding does not stretch indefinitely, and every layer removed is a layer that cannot be replaced. Preservation matters as much as discovery, and that balance slows everything down. One expert involved in the work made that uncertainty clear when describing what has not yet been found. The expectation is that larger animals should also appear in those deeper layers, drawn to the same wetland environment that attracted the camel. But those remains have not yet been uncovered. Not because they are not there, but because the ground that may hold them has not been opened. That leaves a question hanging in place. If tools or clear signs of human activity are eventually confirmed in those deeper sediments, the timeline does not just shift slightly. It moves in a way that forces a complete reevaluation. The presence of people could extend back to 22,000 years. It could reach 25,000 years. It could go even further, into a period that has barely been considered in relation to human movement into the Americas. Some scientists have already begun to follow that line of thought. They are looking toward the last glacial maximum, a time nearly 26,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered vast portions of the northern continents and sea levels dropped dramatically.
Impacted the shaft with a hammerstone and formed this scar on the inside.
That drop would have exposed more of the Pacific coastline, potentially creating routes that no longer exist in the same form today. If people were present during that period, they may have moved along those edges, navigating a landscape that has since been altered or submerged. That possibility changes more than a date on a timeline. It changes the entire framework of how early humans are understood to have lived and moved. It suggests that they were adapting to extreme conditions much earlier than expected, using environments that require awareness, planning, and skill. It also means that the earliest traces of their presence may not be where anyone first thought to look. The pattern is changing. The story that once seemed stable is beginning to open, and each new piece of evidence adds pressure to what had stood unchallenged for nearly a century. Rimrock Draw is no longer just a single site with unusual findings. It has become something more unsettling. It has become a fracture in a long-accepted narrative. And somewhere beneath layers of ash, soil, and ancient silence, the true beginning of human life in the Americas may still be waiting to be uncovered.